First story. It all started with a simple favor. My friend Nate was going on vacation with his wife for a week, and he needed someone to watch his dog, Charlie. I'd known Charlie since Nate adopted him. He was a golden retriever, sweet and gentle, the kind of dog that wouldn't give you any trouble. At the time, I thought it would be a laid-back gig. I mean, how hard could it be to take care of a dog for a week? Nate lived about 10 minutes away from my apartment, so I'd just drive over to his place every day to feed Charlie, take him for walks, and keep him company for a bit. I had no idea how quickly things would spiral out of control. Day one was a breeze. I showed up at Nate's place, let myself in with the key he'd left, and found Charlie waiting by the door, tail wagging like crazy. We went for a walk around the block, and I even tossed the tennis ball for him in the backyard. Easy, right? I thought I was nailing this whole dog-sitting thing. Day two was when things started to get complicated. I arrived at the house, but when I opened the door, Charlie didn't come running. At first, I thought maybe he was just lounging somewhere, but after calling his name a few times and walking through the house, I realized he wasn't inside. Panic set in immediately. I searched every room, checked under the bed, in the closets, everywhere a dog might hide if they were scared or nervous. But no Charlie. The back door was slightly ajar, and that's when it hit me, Charlie must have pushed his way out and escaped. My heart started racing. I couldn't believe I'd lost my friend's dog on day two of a simple week-long favor. I rushed outside and started calling for Charlie, but there was no sign of him. I walked around the neighborhood for hours, asking neighbors if they'd seen a golden retriever. Nothing. I was starting to feel like the worst friend in the world. By the end of the day, I was ready to call Nate and tell him the awful news, but I hesitated. I didn't want to ruin his vacation over something that could still be fixed. So instead, I decided to do something drastic. I slept at Nate's place that night, hoping Charlie would find his way back home. At around 2 a.m., I heard scratching at the back door. I jumped up, ran to the door, and there was Charlie, covered in mud, but looking no worse for wear. Relief washed over me, and I quickly let him inside. I couldn't help but laugh at how guilty he looked, like he knew he'd done something wrong. I cleaned him up, gave him some food, and we both crashed on the couch. Day 3, I decided to keep a much closer eye on Charlie. We stuck to a routine of walks, playtime, and couch lounging. Everything seemed back to normal, but that's when I noticed something strange. Charlie kept scratching at a particular spot on the floor near the back door. At first, I thought he was just being a dog, but he was insistent, digging at the floor with his paws. Curiosity got the best of me, so I moved the small rug that covered the spot he was scratching. To my surprise, there was a loose floorboard. I pulled it up, and underneath, I found an old, dusty metal box. It was locked, but it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I sat there for a minute, debating whether or not to open it. This was Nate's house, after all, and I didn't want to invade his privacy. But then again, I figured it was probably just an old keepsake or something. I convinced myself it wouldn't hurt to take a peek. The lock was rusted, so it wasn't hard to pry open. Inside the box were a few old letters, a stack of photographs, and this part freaked me out a little, a small handgun. I had no idea Nate had something like this in his house. The letters were from someone named Elena, addressed to a man named Victor. The weird part? Nate's real name is Nathaniel, and I'd never heard him mention anyone named Victor or Elena. The photos were old, black and white snapshots of a man and a woman, probably from the 1940s or 50s, and they were definitely not Nate or anyone I recognized. My mind raced with questions. Why did Nate have this box hidden under his floorboards? Who were Victor and Elena? And why the gun? I couldn't sleep that night. I wanted to confront Nate about the box, but I didn't want to admit that I'd found it in the first place. The whole situation felt like something out of a mystery novel, and I didn't know what to do. On day 4, I decided to leave the box where I found it, cover it up, and pretend like nothing happened. Charlie seemed content with our daily routine, and I didn't want to cause any more drama. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than I discovered. Nate and his wife returned on day 7, and I handed Charlie back with a smile, like everything had gone smoothly. Part of me wanted to ask Nate about the box, but I chickened out. Maybe it was none of my business, or maybe I just didn't want to know the truth. To this day, I've never brought it up. But sometimes, when I see Nate, I wonder what secrets are hiding under his floorboards. That week of dog sitting wasn't what I expected at all, but it certainly changed the way I see my friend and his house. I guess sometimes, the people we think we know best have stories they've never told anyone. And maybe it's better that way. Second story. It was supposed to be a fun weekend getaway, just me and my best friend, Danny, taking a road trip up the coast to get some fresh air and escape the monotony of our 9 to 5 jobs. We'd been planning this trip for weeks. Nothing fancy, just a couple of days at a quiet cabin we'd rented near the beach, far away from city noise and responsibilities. We hit the road early on a Friday morning, both of us in good spirits. Danny brought along his old mixtape, and we spent the first hour of the trip blasting music from our high school days, laughing about how ridiculous we used to be. The weather was perfect, clear skies, warm sun, and the kind of cool breeze that made you feel like you were about to have the best weekend of your life. Everything was going smoothly until we hit a small town about halfway to our destination. It wasn't even on the map, the little roadside stop with a gas station, a diner, and a couple of worn-out buildings that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 80s. We weren't in a hurry, so we decided to stop for a bite at the diner. That's when things started to take a turn. The diner was nearly empty, except for an older man behind the counter and a waitress who looked like she was one cigarette away from quitting. We grabbed a booth near the window, ordered some burgers, and settled in. While we were waiting, Danny noticed a flyer pinned to the wall by the bathroom. It was for a local car show happening that evening at some nearby lot. Now, here's the thing, Dan is a total car nut. I swear, if it has wheels and an engine, he's obsessed with it. He immediately started talking about how we should check out the car show before heading to the cabin. At first, I was hesitant. I wasn't that into cars, and the whole reason we were taking this trip was to relax, not stand around in a parking lot with a bunch of gearheads. But Danny was persistent, and before I knew it, we'd decided to stick around for the show. After lunch, we killed some time exploring the small town. There wasn't much to see, a few antique shops, a park that had seen better days, and a convenience store that looked like it might sell snacks that expired last decade. But it was peaceful, and we were both enjoying the change of pace. By the time evening rolled around, we drove to the lot where the car show was supposed to be. To our surprise, the place was packed. There were rows and rows of classic cars, trucks, and even a few motorcycles. Danny was like a kid in a candy store, pointing out different models and talking about their engines like I understood any of it. I mostly nodded along, but I'll admit, the atmosphere was kind of cool. That's when we met him. A guy in his late 40s, leaning against a pristine black Mustang with custom rims that probably cost more than my car. He had that kind of confident swagger that made you think he knew everything about cars, and probably thought he was the coolest guy in town. Danny, of course, struck up a conversation with him right away, asking all sorts of technical questions about the car. The guy, whose name was Greg, was more than happy to show off. He popped the hood, explaining all the modifications he'd made and bragging about how fast it could go. It was all pretty standard car show talk until Greg leaned in a little closer and lowered his voice like he was about to tell us something important. "You boys want to see what this baby can really do?" he asked with a smirk. I immediately got a bad feeling. Danny, on the other hand, was all in. He nodded enthusiastically, like he'd just been offered the chance of a lifetime. Before I could protest, Greg motioned for us to follow him to the edge of the lot where the cars thinned out. There, a small group of people was gathered around, whispering and looking nervous. That's when I realized what was happening: illegal street racing. My stomach dropped. I'd seen enough movies to know how this went down: cops, crashes, and a whole lot of trouble. I tried to talk Danny out of it, but he was already too excited. He and Greg were deep in conversation about the race, and before I knew it, we were climbing into Greg's Mustang. The race was set to take place a few miles out of town on a long, deserted road. I kept telling Danny this was a bad idea, that we should just leave and head to the cabin like we'd planned. But he wasn't hearing it. He'd always been the more adventurous one, the guy who lived for thrills, while I was the cautious, keep-it-safe type. Maybe that's why we were such good friends, we balanced each other out. But right now, it felt like Danny's wild side was about to get us into a whole lot of trouble. We reached the starting point, and Greg lined up his Mustang alongside a few other cars. The air was tense, filled with the sound of revving engines and adrenaline-fueled chatter. I could barely hear myself think over the noise. Before I knew it, the race began. Tires screeched, engines roared, and we shot forward at a speed that made my stomach lurch. I clutched the seat, my knuckles turning white as Greg expertly maneuvered the car down the narrow road. It felt like we were flying. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for a car to spin out of control, for the cops to show up, for anything. And then, just as I feared, it happened. Red and blue lights flashed behind us. A cop car came out of nowhere, sirens blaring. Greg cursed under his breath and slammed on the gas, trying to outrun them. My heart sank. We were screwed. There was no way this was going to end well. After what felt like an eternity of high-speed chasing, Greg finally pulled off the road and into a wooded area. The cop car sped past us, clearly having lost track of where we'd gone. We sat in the car, dead silent, for what felt like hours, waiting for the coast to clear. When we finally made it back to town, we were both shaken. Danny looked like he was regretting every decision he'd made that night, and I was just thankful we weren't in handcuffs. Greg, however, seemed completely unfazed, like this was just another night for him. We left the car show without saying a word to anyone, drove in silence back to the cabin, and didn't speak much for the rest of the weekend. What was supposed to be a relaxing getaway had turned into one of the most stressful nights of my life. Danny apologized 100 times, but I told him it was fine. And in the end, it was. We didn't get arrested, nobody got hurt, and we learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, a quiet weekend away is all the excitement you need. But man, I'll never forget that night. It was the closest I've ever come to getting arrested, and it all happened because we stopped at a random diner in a town we didn't even know existed. Third story. So, here's a story I never thought I'd tell. And, honestly, I never thought I'd live through it either. It's one of those situations where everything just kind of happened, and I found myself in way deeper than I ever intended. It all started with my motorcycle. I've had this old Honda Shadow for a few years. Nothing fancy, but it's my pride and joy. I'm not some hardcore biker or anything, I just like taking it out on weekends for a long ride, escape the city for a while, clear my head. I've always ridden alone, which is fine by me. No big biker gang ambitions here. But a couple of months ago, I was out for a Saturday ride, just cruising along some backroads outside of town. The weather was perfect, and I was planning to stop at this little diner I love, have a burger, and head home. The ride was going great until I noticed a group of bikers up ahead, all on Harleys, riding in a tight formation. I figured I'd just ride behind them for a bit, no big deal. At first, it was casual. They didn't seem to notice me trailing behind, so I kept my distance. But then, one of the guys at the back of the pack looked over his shoulder and waved at me. It wasn't an aggressive wave or anything, more like an invitation. I waved back out of reflex, not really thinking much of it. Next thing I know, they slowed down just enough for me to catch up and join their formation. I thought it was kind of cool, honestly, riding with a group for once. There was something oddly satisfying about the rumble of all those engines in unison. Plus, these guys seemed friendly enough. They were all wearing leather vests with patches on them, but I didn't pay much attention to what the patches said. I figured they were just a local riding club, out for a weekend ride like me. So, I rolled with them for a while, assuming they were heading in the same direction as I was. But after about 20 minutes, they took a turn I wasn't expecting. Instead of heading towards the diner, they veered off onto a smaller road that led deeper into the countryside. I thought about breaking off and going my own way, but I didn't want to be rude. I figured I'd ride with them for a bit longer and then peel off when it made sense. We ended up at this dusty old bar in the middle of nowhere. It looked like something out of a movie, a rundown building with a neon sign flickering in the window, a few beat-up trucks in the parking lot, and not much else around for miles. The group parked their bikes, and so did I, still not fully understanding what I was getting myself into. As we dismounted, one of the bikers, a big guy with a beard down to his chest, walked over to me and clapped me on the back. "Nice ride," he said, looking over my Honda. "Didn't think we'd see someone like you join up today." I just nodded, still playing it cool. "Thanks, man," I said, not entirely sure what he meant by someone like you. I figured maybe he was just complimenting my bike. A little out of place among all the Harleys, but hey, I thought they were being nice. That's when things started getting a little weird. We all walked into the bar, and as soon as we got inside, the atmosphere shifted. The bartender clearly knew the group, he nodded at them and immediately started pouring drinks, no questions asked. The rest of the bar's patrons looked at me with this strange mix of curiosity and suspicion, like they knew something I didn't. The bikers sat down at a big table in the corner, and I followed along, still feeling like the new guy at a family reunion where I didn't know anyone. Drinks were passed around, and one of the bikers introduced himself as Grizz. The others all had nicknames too: Tank, Bulldog, Tiny, who was ironically the biggest of the bunch. I gave them my name, and they nodded like I'd just passed some kind of test. Grizz started talking about the job, and how things were finally coming together. I tried to tune out the details, because it felt like a private conversation, but the more I listened, the more I realized they were talking about something serious. Something not exactly legal. "We'll head out at dawn," Grizz said, taking a long swig from his beer. "Got the route planned. Should be clean, but we've got backup just in case." I froze. What exactly had I gotten myself into? Was this some kind of heist? A drug deal? My mind started racing with possibilities, and none of them were good. I knew I needed to get out of there, but I didn't want to make a scene. I tried to keep cool and casually excused myself to the bathroom. Once I was out of sight, I slipped out the back door of the bar and made a beeline for my bike. I hopped on, fired up the engine, and peeled out of the parking lot as quietly as I could. For the next half hour, I was convinced they were going to come after me. Every time a truck passed by, I thought it was them, coming to drag me back into whatever shady operation they were planning. But no one followed. I eventually made it back to the main road and headed straight home, heart pounding the entire way. The whole ride back, I kept thinking about how easily I'd stumbled into something dangerous. All I wanted was a quiet ride and maybe a good burger, and I ended up nearly becoming an accidental member of what I'm pretty sure was a biker gang involved in some kind of criminal activity. I didn't tell anyone about it for a few days. I wasn't even sure what to say. Hey, guess what? I almost got roped into a biker gang by accident. It sounded ridiculous, but it was true. A week later, I saw a news report about a group of bikers arrested for smuggling stolen goods across state lines. The names were different, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might have been the same crew I'd ridden with that day. Needless to say, I've been a little more cautious about who I ride with since then. And I stick to my solo weekend trips now. No more random biker gangs for me, thanks.